Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here on a Friday morning. Thank you for the sort of the introduction as well as your perspectives from OSA on open access. So as Elizabeth said, I'm Daniel Kulp. I'm the editorial director for the Journals of the American Physical Society. Just for those who don't know the society, we have 50,000 member physicists. Though we're U.S.-centric, we do have about 20% of our members are international. Of course, though we have a lot of societal programs and outreach activities, for this talk in open access, I'm going to concentrate strictly on the journals. Basically, what I would like to do first is just to at least put the journal program into some context, talk a little bit then about the society's stance on open access, and then quickly, I hope, move into some examples of how APS interacts both in green, public, and gold open access, spending most of the time on the last item. So first off, the Physical Review family of journals goes back to 1893. This actually predates the society itself, which was formed in 1899. What's interesting is it started off as this little backwater U.S.-based journal competing against the major European publishers in physics and chemistry publishing. And since then, it's grown substantially. As you can see from the timeline, it's been growing and then breaking off into pieces consistently till the present time, where we have 10 journals. We publish roughly 19,000 articles and a total of 160,000 pages of physics annually. To do this, we have a centralized editorial office that has 50 full-time editors, most of whom have PhDs, and about 60 part-time remote associate editors that are spread throughout the world. I don't see any of my friends from AIP here, but I like this graph too, because if you notice right there at the bottom, Journal of Applied Physics, we actually started it back in the 1930s. And the physicists at the time, since they were in their ivory towers, had deigned to get their hands dirty with applied physics. So they asked AIP to take over the journal. And if you know anything about their publishing house, that's one of their primary and strongest titles. So anyway, open access. As a society, of course, the main purpose is sort of the advancing and diffusing of knowledge of physics. And so the open access policy or position that the APS takes falls within that line. We support open access, but of course, even though we're a not-for-profit, we are definitely not for loss. To maintain our services, to maintain the peer review process and everything, we do need revenues. And so we have the caveat at the end that we're willing to do just about anything as long as the long-term financial stability of the publishing branch and especially the society is maintained. And that's a key feature. So before I get into some of the models we're applying to investigate how open access and sort of revenue-driven or diversification of revenue sources comes into play, I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of our altruistic side. These are positions that the APS has taken that some might say we're giving away our content. First off, the archive. For physicists, the archive, which started in the early 90s, is a place where is a new place at which they disseminate their early information. Right, this is where their e-prints or their preprints exist. We've coexisted with the archive since its beginnings. We're actually closely tied with the archive. Our director of our Journal Information Services is a physicist who used to work with Paul Ginsberg at Los Alamos on the archive. And so we have very close connections, and we support the archive. And so we have no restrictions on authors sending their preprints to the archive and yet then submitting it to our journals for consideration. We have also gone beyond what many consider the standard green OA position, where the author is allowed to put their own version on their institutional website. We actually give the author the right to put our version, so they're actually able to download the APS formatted version and put it on their own website or their institutional website. Now, of course, this is an author right. And when the Harvard and MIT faculties had made the decision to try to consolidate the work of their faculty members and to bring it into their own institutional repositories, they had asked that addenda be added to most of the copyright agreements that they signed with publishers. Well, we looked at it and we felt that, well, one is we're a small operation in that sense, that we don't have much overhead in handling it, so we did not want all these addenda attached. And so we made direct agreements with both Harvard and MIT. We signed a single contract that encompassed their entire faculty that says that the authors were able to sign our standard copyright, but Harvard and MIT sort of had the right as co-authors, essentially, to be able to capture our formatted version and put it on their institutional repositories. Also, relatively recently, we had changed our copyright agreement at the pressure of a few of our authors that allowed them to make derivative works. Essentially, these authors had wanted to put some of their work on Wikipedia. And to do so, they needed to have the right to do it. So they needed to retain copyright. So what we did is we allowed them to reuse up to 50% of their published work, rewrite it in any form they'd like, recast it as, say, an article for Wikipedia, and they retained the right, and therefore they were able to publish it as they saw fit. And also, as Elizabeth said, over the past couple years, there's been a lot of give and take and a lot of conversation about public access. I mean, for most of the public access advocates, this means just having it out there, freely available for anyone to look at, anyone to go into, text mine, etc. The APS took a slightly different view. In an effort not to hurt our revenue streams by just throwing our content out there freely, we did understand the need for the public in some cases to have access to scientific data. So what we did in 2010 is we opened up our entire archive, so that's everything back to 1893, to the public library system, the U.S. public library system. So any library in the U.S. just has to register with us, agree to have the electronic version of our journals available only within the walls of the building. So there's no proxy servers, no external access. And if they were willing to do this, they got our content free at no cost to themselves or to the taxpayers. This worked fairly well. We have about just under 600 libraries that have signed on. And it was successful enough that there was inquiries from high schools, and so we've made the same program available to U.S. high schools. So currently we have about 120 high schools that are signed up to receive our content free of cost. Right now, what we're looking at is we're trying to expand it. For us, it was fairly straightforward in how to define a U.S. public high school, a U.S. public library. It's a little more difficult when you go into other nations and when you start spreading internationally. So we're beginning to work with other societies that have a firmer ground within their own countries to help us define what is the equivalent of a public library. And we hope to expand it, this program. Oops, sorry about that. So now on to gold open access, I'm sorry. So in 98, we were approached by a very small community of accelerator physicists that had complained that they had no specific journal to call their own. And so we created what we were then thinking would be a whole series of journals called special topic journals. And so the first one started in 98 for accelerators and beams. It was what is considered now a gold open access journal. As with Optics Express, it was sort of came into existence before a lot of this conversation and these definitions came into play. But what was interesting about this is very much like the Scope 3 model. It's supported by contributions. In a Scope 3 model, where it's essentially contributions by libraries to get free access, here the contributions are by the major accelerator laboratories. And so what they do is they contribute annually to the journal, and the idea is all papers published there are freely accessible to all readers. It has been somewhat successful, but as you can imagine, as receipts continue to increase and published articles continue to increase, so do the expenses. And unfortunately, there's only a limited number of accelerator labs in the world, and with funding cuts, there's probably fewer than there were a decade ago. And so it's a lot of effort and very difficult to maintain a revenue stream. And so traditionally, over the past few years, the APS has continued to support the journal at the level of about $30,000 or $40,000 per year. About half a decade ago, we were approached by a second small community of specialists in physics education, and they had asked in a similar way for a journal that they could call home. In this case, what they were looking for was a journal that would publish real research into understanding how to teach physics. Their usual venues were usually case studies. I gave this test, the students answered this way, but if I changed the test question this way, we had a much higher rate of success. But here they wanted to actually go in depth into the science behind the process of education. So we started that journal in 2005. It's still a relatively small journal. However, in this case, we decided to try the more standard mode of having an article processing charge to each individual author to pay for the journal. Again, though relatively successful, this is another model that has not reached the break-even point. APS continues to support it, again, at the level of about $30,000 or $40,000 a year. So these are our first two small experiments into the open access realm. For example, the Accelerators and Beams journal publishes about 200 articles a year, and the Physics Education Research journal publishes about 40 articles a year. So they're very small compared to our other journals. So also in 2006, we began to formalize what we wanted to do with open access, in this case to try to spread it to our other subscription-based journals, creating sort of a hybrid mode, as Elizabeth had said. And our first approach was to look at, in a very naive way, what was it that the readers were after. And from our point of view, they just wanted access, no barriers, nothing in their way. They wanted to get to a paper. And this is what we called free to read. We still retained copyright. We made the PDF available. They were able to download it, read it without any interference. However, reuse, repurposing was not allowed within this model. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the discussions on open access that have occurred over the last few years, that is not, to a lot of people, sufficient for open access. And so, in fact, recently we re-examined how we were offering open access, and we brought it more in line, I believe, with what was being requested by the community. So in 2011, we switched from free to read to Creative Commons licensing. In this case, we decided to let the authors retain copyright, and that we would have the agreement to be first to publish. However, when we put it out to the readership or to the users, it would be an attribution-only license. So it was, at the time, probably the most liberal of the CC licenses. Basically, as long as people attribute it to the published version, they can basically take it, rehash it, redo it, republish it, commercialize it, whatever they like. So also around this time, we began thinking of starting a new journal. As Elizabeth mentioned, there was new terminology coming into the marketplace, these mega journals. PLOS One was probably the one who first coined the term. And so we looked at our own internal processes. Now, as I said, APS publishes about 19,000 articles a year. Well, we also reject about 18,000. And in some ways, if you look at it in a very naive fashion, again, you can say, well, if we were to create a journal that published those 18,000 articles at an article processing charge of about $1,500, that's a revenue stream of about $27 million. Hey, that practically doubles our revenue stream, right? Not bad. Now, of course, I I have to say, probably, realistically, no more than half of those are really papers worth publishing within the literature. But you get an idea of the scale and the attractiveness of going into this area of a mega journal. However, as we approached this in this PLOS One type mentality, we had gotten a huge amount of pushback from our executive board, our members, our advisory committees, where they said that no, the physical review name really was a stamp of excellence, and that it would be tarnished if we try to capture these papers that wouldn't normally be publishable. In fact, what was missing in the whole landscape of open access, at least within the physics realm, was a really high end. I mean, we're talking competitor to Nature Physics, we're talking about a competitor to our own physical review letters. I mean, we're talking high impact, small volume, really focused on the very best papers possible. We really wanted to push open access, get the papers that would be highly cited, highly viewed, and put them into a journal. And so with that in mind, we moved forward on a new journal, which is just barely a year old, called Physical Review X. And so like most new journals that have been brought into the marketplace, it's open access, online only. However, unlike PLOS One and journals like AIP Advances, where they only look for technical correctness, there are very high editorial standards looking to see what is the actual impact within the field and even the broader impact for interdisciplinary studies. So the attempt was to make an efficient, responsive review process. Since we're talking small volume, there's very much a hands-on interaction between the editor and the referees, the editor and the authors. This was an attempt to maintain very high, strict standards of peer review, but to speed it up. Initially, the receipt to acceptance time is about 45 days. It has crept up as the volume has increased, so we're in more like the 60, 65-day realm. So the scaling issue is one that has to be carefully considered. But as you can see, we priced it what we felt was fairly and well at $1,500 per article. Comments that we've received from some of the authors that have published with us, where it seems that it has at least struck a chord with some people within the community, where they feel that the process really led to significant improvement of the paper and presentation, that the interaction between the authors and referees were at a very high level, and that they were very satisfied with how the review process went. So as I said, it's been in existence for about a year. May of last year is when we made the announcement that we were looking for papers. We had decided at the time that we would offer no reductions or waivers of the author processing charge, meaning there would be no hardship cases. The only exceptions were that if there were any authors from a nation at which we gave free subscriptions to because of their economic climate, that we would also allow those authors to publish for free. But beyond that, there were no other hardship cases. So far within the first year, we received about 374 submissions. 199 of them were rejected outright by the editors without any type of external review. And to date, we've published about 62 papers. There's still about 60 papers under review, of which a third of them are likely to be accepted. If you run through the numbers, you'll see that this journal has about a 20% acceptance rate, which for the APS would make it the most exclusive journal we have. As a means of comparison, PRL has an acceptance rate closer to 26, 27%. Okay, and so that's all I have. So I thank you very much for your attention and your time.